This is the fraction of tritium that was in the material to start with, against time, being electrolyzed as the cathode in a normal cold fusion cell. And you can see that the tritium in the gas phase rose and was almost all of it. There was very little of it that appeared in the electrolyte. So in other words, tritium that is present, known to be present, has an entirely different behavior than tritium that's being produced in a cold fusion cell. We were also able to show, using the tritium as a tracer, how this loss here is a first order reaction. We could relate that to some of the properties of the palladium, and we could understand why it is that the tritium was going into the gas phase. Well, all that was very interesting, but again, it had essentially no effect on the skeptics. Now, one of the things that we discovered and began to appreciate is the role of cracking. I mean, palladium, when it takes up deuterium or hydrogen, cracks. And this isn't so very obvious because when you look at it, you don't see anything. It just holds together there beautifully, but it in fact does crack. And we began to appreciate the role of these cracks in defining the amount of deuterium that you can put into palladium, which is one of the critical parameters. You have to be able to load it up to very high values. And the cracks offer paths through which the deuterium can leave the palladium. In other words, you're trying to fill a leaky bucket. And we found out that most palladium is so leaky that you can never fill it. To just give you an idea of the nature of these cracks and how they're understood, this is a plot of the volume fraction increase, that is the expansion, physical expansion, as the hydrogen to palladium ratio is increased. And we go through the alpha phase, which is hydrogen simply dissolved in the metal, to the beta phase, which is a crystal structure that's a reorientation of the original structure, and the expansion that you measure physically by these dots tracks that which you'd expect from the lattice parameter increase until you get up to here. And then the lattice parameter increase shows that it should do this, whereas the physical measurement shows that there's an extra volume being generated. That extra volume is caused by the cracks. So that's sort of the average effect of these cracks. It turns out, and you'll see a little later the importance of this, that most palladium cracks. And every time you go through this cycle, you get more cracks. In fact, as we've repeated over and over again and have built up a concentration of 30% volume excess in these things. And other people have gone even further than that many years ago when this was acknowledged. And in fact, if you take a plate, a thin film of the stuff, this was done back in the early 30s, and load it and deload it, load it and deload it, it turns slowly into a little cube because of the changes in dimensions. Anyway, so this is an important aspect of palladium's chemistry, and it's an important aspect in determining whether or not you will make any excess energy. Well, about that time, I wrote my first review, and on the basis of that accumulated knowledge, I persuaded my division leader to fund a study of the heat-producing effects of this phenomena. And so I constructed a calorimeter which had contained in it all of the attributes that the skeptics demanded. It was stirred, it was sealed, it had a recombiner inside of it, it had multiple temperature readings inside. The stoichiometry was determined by putting deuterium gas in here and measuring the change in deuterium gas pressure as it loaded. So we had to measure stoichiometry as a function of time. It also had a reference electrode in there so we could measure the open circuit voltage. And I'll get into what that is a little later. But that's also an important thing to measure. Anyway, this was an isoparabolic calorimeter. It measured the temperature of the water surrounding the cell It wasn't a flow type. I mean, we measured the input and the output, but it was flowing so rapidly there was very little difference between them. We just wanted a constant temperature surrounding it. Rather than putting it into water bath, we brought the water bath out. That way we could keep track of the cell and look at it. And so we measured the inside temperature and the outside temperature. Now the results. Now I should point out that about the time we got this thing done, the Japanese were having some rather spectacular effects. Takahashi in Japan had demonstrated in one of his cells heats up to 75 watts. I mean, it was just mind-blowing. I mean, nobody had gotten anywhere close to that. And of course, nobody believed it. So he sent me a sample of his material. And I put it in my calorimeter. And this is what we got. Now, I might point out this calorimeter can be calibrated on the fly. It contains an internal joule heater, so you can calibrate it as you go. Anyway, this is 220 hours from the beginning. Back in here, there were also some heat bursts, making maybe up to 2 watts. Nothing very exciting to skeptics, but very exciting to me. But eventually, it got to this situation. And I need to show this to you in more detail. This is the excess energy. That's the energy over and above what we're putting in, measured by the calorimeter. And these blue points are taken at 2.8 amperes applied current. The other points you see down here are a lower current. So you can see once again, which has been shown over and over again now, that there is a critical current density that's required to initiate the effect. Below that, nothing happens. Above that, we see this effect. This was calibrated at this point. It was calibrated again here, and it was calibrated again here. All of those calibrations showed no drift, no change. Unfortunately, the recombiner in the cell started to go bad, and that's the reason why the apparent power is going down, because a lot of that energy is being carried away in the gas. And we know that because we had an external recombiner with a thermocouple on it, and we could see it was heating up and recombining gas that was supposed to be recombined within the cell. If we assume that there was no recombination in the cell, then our calculated excess would have been up here, and this would have been extending up like that. All right, I thought this was pretty dramatic evidence that something was going on. This is certainly not, as many of the skeptics would argue, statistical noise. Now, the interesting thing was that after we ran this, the Japanese supplied me with another piece of palladium, which was manufactured, as they say, in the same manner as the first piece. That second piece was dead, so nothing. Now, there was a difference between the first piece and the second piece. The first piece had an excess volume of a little over 1%, maybe just about 2% excess volume. The second piece had around 13% excess volume. So those two pieces of palladium were quite different from one another in that respect, and again, were quite different in their respect of producing excess energy. Well, having heard that, then they went back and made a third batch, which they say was done exactly the way the first. I mean, the second batch they had done it, not exactly the same, because who knows what's important. But this time they did a Japanese copy, so to speak, and it made excess energy, and it made not as much, but then it had a higher excess volume. So we were pretty convinced that the cracking was an important parameter, and therefore the materials characteristics of palladium needed to be examined in some detail to find out how to avoid this.